The most dangerous lie you'll ever believe isn't that you don't have enough money. It's that the voice telling you that has always been your own. Claire Bennett stared at the stack of papers on the table while her hand hovered just inches above the signature line. The room was silent except for the ticking of an old clock that had belonged to her mother, and every second seemed to whisper the same message she had heard her entire life. People like us never get ahead. Across from her, Ethan Miller suddenly leaned forward and quietly said, "Don't sign anything yet." Claire looked up with tired eyes. "You don't understand. I don't have another choice." Ethan didn't argue. He simply asked one question. "What if the choice you're about to make isn't yours?" Claire frowned. "What does that even mean?" Ethan's expression never changed. "Have you ever wondered why the same kind of financial struggle keeps finding different people in the same family? Different jobs, different cities, different decades, yet somehow the same ending." Claire's breathing slowed. She wanted to dismiss the question, but something inside her refused to let it go. Ethan continued, his voice calm enough to make every word feel heavier. "Most people think poverty begins when money disappears. It doesn't. It begins years earlier, when the brain quietly decides that safety is more important than possibility." Claire looked away, trying to silence the memories rushing back without warning. A kitchen table, raised voices, bills spread across faded wood, a child listening from another room. Ethan spoke again before she could answer. "Your bank account isn't the first place where poverty is created. Your mind is," Claire whispered, almost to herself. "Then why does it feel so real?" Ethan gave a small nod. "Because your brain has been practicing the same story for years. And once a story feels familiar, it starts feeling true." Claire slowly pulled her hand away from the papers. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of losing money. She was afraid that everything she believed about money had never belonged to her in the first place. And before she could ask the question that would change everything, Ethan quietly said, "If you're ready to discover who taught your mind to fear abundance, then your real journey begins now. Meeting my true soul warmly welcomes you." Before we go any further, pause for just a moment and ask yourself a question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. When was the first time you believed that having money was difficult? Not the first time you struggled to pay a bill. Not the first time your checking account made your heart race. I mean the very first moment your mind quietly accepted the idea that abundance belonged to someone else. Most people cannot answer that question because the memory is buried beneath years of routine, responsibility, and survival. Yet that hidden moment often shapes every financial decision they make without them ever realizing it. Claire Bennett sat silently, still looking at the unsigned papers. They represented more than a financial decision. They represented another chapter in a story she had repeated so many times that it no longer felt like a story. It felt like reality. She remembered working overtime, taking extra projects, skipping vacations, telling herself that one more sacrifice would finally create security. Somehow, every time she reached what she thought was solid ground, another unexpected expense appeared. A broken water heater, medical bills, car repairs, rising grocery prices. It was as though every dollar she earned already belonged to a problem she had not met yet. Friends admired her discipline. Family praised her work ethic. Yet inside, Claire carried an invisible fear that never seemed to leave. She was not afraid of working hard. She was afraid that no amount of work would ever be enough. Ethan Miller watched the expression on her face without interrupting. He had seen that look before. It appeared in entrepreneurs, teachers, nurses, business owners, retirees, and young professionals. Different lives, different incomes, the same quiet exhaustion hiding behind different smiles. Eventually Claire spoke. "Why does it always feel like I am catching up instead of moving forward?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the old window overlooking the quiet neighborhood. Children rode bicycles across the street while neighbors waved to one another, completely unaware that inside this small living room, one simple conversation was beginning to challenge decades of invisible programming. "Have you ever noticed," Ethan finally said, "that your brain does not ask whether a belief is true? It asks whether a belief is familiar." Claire frowned. "I thought the brain wanted the truth." Ethan smiled gently. "It wants certainty much more than truth. If fear has been repeated often enough, your brain starts protecting it as though it were keeping you alive." Claire slowly lowered herself into the chair. The sentence settled over her like a heavy blanket. Suddenly memories she had not visited in years began returning without permission. She remembered standing beside a shopping cart as a little girl while her mother quietly put groceries back on the shelf after realizing they had reached the limit on their budget. She remembered hearing adults whisper that rich people were selfish, lucky, dishonest, or simply different from ordinary families. She remembered hearing someone laugh and say, "Money never stays with people like us." At the time, those words sounded ordinary. Children rarely question the emotional language surrounding them because they assume the adults already understand how the world works. They absorb beliefs long before they learn how to examine them. Ethan looked back toward Claire. Nobody teaches a child to question fear. They teach a child to survive it. The problem is that survival habits often remain long after the danger has disappeared. Claire quietly nodded. She had never considered that possibility. She had spent years reading books about budgeting, investing, productivity, and financial planning. She had learned strategies, spreadsheets, retirement accounts, and savings goals. Yet no one had ever asked what emotional story her mind attached to every dollar she earned. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. Imagine planting healthy seeds in soil that secretly rejects every root. No matter how carefully you water them, something beneath the surface keeps preventing healthy growth. Most people spend years replacing the leaves while ignoring the soil. Claire looked again at the papers on the table. For the first time, she wondered if the biggest obstacle standing between her and financial peace had never been the economy, her career, or even her income. Perhaps the obstacle had been quietly speaking inside her own mind for so long that she mistook it for her own voice. Claire remained silent, but inside her mind something had already begun to shift. She realized that Ethan had not tried to convince her that she could become wealthy overnight. He had not promised a secret investment, a miracle opportunity, or a shortcut to financial freedom. Instead, he had quietly challenged something far more uncomfortable. He had challenged the relationship between familiarity and identity. Ethan walked back toward the table and gently picked up a small notebook that had been lying beside the stack of papers. He placed it in front of Claire without opening it. "Before we talk about changing your future," he said softly, "we have to understand why your mind keeps returning to the same destination." Claire looked confused. "I do not choose to struggle." Ethan nodded. "I know. Almost nobody consciously chooses it. That is exactly why it continues." Claire leaned back in her chair, still trying to understand. Ethan continued, "Your conscious mind makes plans. It creates budgets. It sets financial goals. It watches motivational videos. But your subconscious mind has a different job. It protects whatever it believes is familiar, even when familiar creates suffering." Claire looked down at her hands. "So you are saying my own mind is working against me?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "Not against you. It believes it is protecting you." Those words landed differently. Protection had never been something she associated with anxiety, fear, or financial stress. Ethan noticed the question forming before she asked it. "Think about a smoke alarm," he said. "Its purpose is to keep you safe. But imagine if it became so sensitive that every piece of toast triggered it. Eventually, you would stop trusting it, even though it still believed it was helping you." Claire smiled faintly for the first time that day. "So my brain is like an overprotective alarm?" "Exactly," Ethan replied. "It learned long ago that uncertainty felt dangerous. If your childhood connected money with arguments, disappointment, embarrassment, or fear, then abundance itself may begin to feel unfamiliar. And anything unfamiliar often feels unsafe." Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Images continued to rise from somewhere deep inside her memory. Birthday parties where her parents quietly explained why expensive gifts were impossible. Family conversations filled with phrases like, "We cannot afford that," or "People with money always lose what matters most." At the time, those statements seemed harmless. They sounded like facts. Yet now she wondered whether they had quietly become instructions. Ethan spoke again. "Have you ever noticed that two people can receive the exact same opportunity and respond completely differently? One feels excited. The other feels suspicious. One sees possibility. The other immediately imagines failure. The opportunity is identical. Only the internal story changes." Claire nodded slowly. She remembered declining promotions because they felt overwhelming. She remembered delaying business ideas because she convinced herself the timing was never right. She remembered feeling guilty after receiving unexpected bonuses, as though success required an apology. None of those reactions had seemed unusual before today. Ethan continued with the same calm certainty. Most people believe thoughts create emotions. Sometimes that is true, but many times emotions create thoughts. Fear arrives first. Then the mind quickly invents logical explanations to justify it. Claire whispered, "So I thought I was making rational financial decisions. Perhaps you were making emotionally familiar decisions," Ethan answered gently. "There is a difference." The room became quiet again. Outside, the afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the front yard, reminding Claire that time continued moving whether people noticed it or not. Ethan picked up the old clock from the shelf and carefully turned it toward her. "Look at this clock. It keeps perfect time because the same movement repeats over and over again. Your subconscious works in a similar way. Repetition becomes rhythm. Rhythm becomes expectation. Expectation becomes identity. Eventually, you stop asking whether the pattern is true because you begin believing that the pattern is you." Claire felt an unexpected heaviness in her chest. She had always introduced herself as someone who had to work harder than everyone else just to stay afloat. She had worn resilience like a badge of honor. But now another possibility appeared. What if resilience had quietly become permission to expect struggle forever? Ethan carefully placed the clock back on the shelf. The greatest illusion your mind creates is not convincing you that life is difficult. It is convincing you that difficulty is who you are. Claire looked once more at the unsigned papers. They had not changed. Her financial situation had not magically improved. The numbers were exactly the same as they had been an hour earlier. Yet something invisible had already begun changing beneath the surface. For the first time in years, she wondered whether the life she had been fighting was not being controlled by circumstances alone, but by an ancient story her mind had repeated so faithfully that it no longer sounded like fear. It sounded like truth. Claire could not stop thinking about one sentence. Your subconscious protects what feels familiar, even when familiarity creates suffering. The words echoed inside her long after Ethan stopped speaking. She looked around the living room, noticing details she had ignored for years. The old clock, the faded family photographs, the coffee mug with a small crack near the handle that she had refused to replace because, in her own words, it still worked. Suddenly, she wondered how many parts of her life had quietly become monuments to endurance instead of invitations to growth. Ethan sat across from her without rushing the silence. He understood that some ideas could not be forced. They had to settle naturally, the way snow slowly covers a field without making a sound. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "If my mind keeps choosing what is familiar, how do I know when it is happening?" Ethan smiled gently. "It happens every time your first reaction is stronger than the facts in front of you." Claire looked puzzled. Ethan continued, "Imagine someone offers you an opportunity that honestly matches your skills. Before you even examine it, your stomach tightens. Your mind immediately says, it is probably too risky. Someone else is more qualified. I will fail. I should wait." Notice something important. Those thoughts arrive before the evidence. Your subconscious has already reached a conclusion, and your conscious mind simply begins collecting reasons to support it. Claire remembered countless moments exactly like that. She remembered receiving an invitation to join a growing consulting firm several years earlier. The salary had been better. The benefits had been stronger. Even the commute was shorter. Yet instead of feeling excited, she spent days listing everything that could possibly go wrong until she finally convinced herself to decline the offer. Months later, she learned that several former colleagues had accepted similar positions and were thriving. At the time, she blamed bad timing. Now she wondered whether something deeper had been guiding her decision. Ethan leaned forward. Fear rarely introduces itself by saying, "Hello, I am fear." It usually arrives wearing the mask of practicality. Claire slowly nodded. That sentence felt painfully accurate. How many times had she called fear responsibility? How many times had she called self-doubt realism? How many dreams had quietly disappeared because caution sounded wiser than courage? Ethan continued, "Your brain has one primary mission: keep you alive. It is not designed to make you wealthy. It is not designed to help you discover your purpose. It is not designed to maximize your happiness. Those things become possible only after your brain believes they are safe." Claire thought about that carefully. Society often praised people for staying inside their comfort zone while calling it stability. Yet she could now see that stability and emotional familiarity were not always the same thing. Sometimes what felt stable was simply an old wound repeating itself in a predictable pattern. Ethan stood and walked toward a bookshelf. He picked up a small snow globe and gently shook it. Tiny white flakes swirled wildly through the water. "Look closely," he said. "For a few moments, everything looks chaotic. But if we stop interfering, every particle eventually settles back into place." Claire watched the flakes slowly drift downward. "The subconscious works much like this," Ethan explained. "Every experience stirs your emotions. But unless you consciously create a new pattern, everything eventually settles back into its old arrangement." Claire suddenly remembered the weeks after receiving her largest annual bonus. Instead of feeling grateful or hopeful, she immediately worried about losing it. Within months, unexpected purchases, unnecessary spending, and impulsive decisions had quietly erased nearly all of it. She had blamed bad luck. Today she questioned whether she had unconsciously restored a level of financial discomfort that felt emotionally familiar. Ethan seemed to sense the realization crossing her face. "Many people believe they sabotage themselves because they lack discipline," he said softly. "More often they sabotage themselves because success creates an unfamiliar identity." Claire whispered. "So even something good can feel dangerous." "Exactly," Ethan replied. "If struggle has become part of your identity, peace may actually feel uncomfortable. If scarcity has defined your life, abundance can feel suspicious. The mind often rejects what the heart secretly longs for because the unknown feels more frightening than the familiar." Claire lowered her eyes once again to the unsigned documents. The papers had become strangely symbolic. They no longer represented only a financial decision. They represented every moment in her life when fear quietly disguised itself as wisdom. And for the first time, she understood that before any number in her bank account could truly change, something far older and far quieter inside her own mind would have to learn that safety did not have to come from repeating yesterday. Claire remained motionless, but inside her something had begun to loosen. She had spent years believing that changing her financial life required finding better opportunities, making smarter decisions, or working even harder. Now another possibility stood quietly in front of her. What if the greatest change did not begin with action at all? What if it began with awareness? Ethan reached into the drawer beneath the table and removed a faded photograph. The edges had softened with time, and the colors had almost disappeared. He placed it beside the old clock. "Do you know why memories have so much influence over the future?" he asked. Claire looked at the photograph, but did not recognize the people in it. She slowly shook her head. Ethan answered before she could ask another question. "Because your brain does not store memories as history. It stores them as instructions." Claire looked at him carefully. "Instructions?" Ethan nodded. "Especially emotional memories. Facts fade. Feelings remain. A child rarely remembers the exact words adults use, but the emotions surrounding those words become invisible rules that guide future decisions." Claire suddenly remembered one particular evening that had never seemed important until now. She had been about 9 years old. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window while her mother quietly sorted envelopes across the table. Utility bills, mortgage statements, credit card balances. Claire had asked an innocent question. "Mom, why do you always look worried when the mail comes?" Her mother had smiled, but it was the kind of smile adults use when they are trying to protect children from adult fears. "Because money always brings problems," she had answered. Then she returned to opening the envelopes. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet somehow that simple moment had survived inside Claire for decades. She had forgotten hundreds of birthdays, countless television shows, and thousands of ordinary conversations. But that feeling remained perfectly alive. Ethan watched her expression change. "Something came back, did it not?" Claire nodded slowly. "I remembered something I had not thought about in years." Ethan smiled gently. "That is how emotional programming works. It hides in plain sight. It waits quietly beneath your awareness until a familiar situation activates it again." Claire closed her eyes. More memories surfaced. Relatives praising people who worked themselves to exhaustion while criticizing anyone who appeared financially successful. Neighbors saying that wealthy families always had hidden problems. Adults repeating that life was supposed to be difficult because struggle built character. None of those statements had seemed cruel. They were spoken casually, almost lovingly. Yet each sentence quietly painted the same picture. Abundance belonged somewhere else. Ethan folded his hands together. Children rarely inherit money. They inherit beliefs about money. Claire slowly repeated those words to herself. They felt heavier than anything she had heard that afternoon. Ethan continued. By the time most people become adults, they already have thousands of emotional associations connected to earning, spending, saving, receiving, giving, and deserving. Very few of those associations were consciously chosen. Claire suddenly understood why logic had failed her for so many years. Every financial book she had read had tried to change her behavior. None had addressed the emotional blueprint beneath her behavior. Ethan looked toward the window where the afternoon sunlight had begun turning golden. Think about learning to drive, he said. At first, every movement requires conscious attention. Eventually, your body performs hundreds of actions automatically. Your subconscious learns through repetition. Emotional beliefs develop the same way. Repeated experiences become automatic responses. Claire quietly whispered. Then every time I felt anxious about money, my brain was not creating something new. It was replaying something old. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Your mind often confuses repetition with reality. Claire felt an unexpected wave of compassion toward the younger version of herself. She imagined that little girl standing beside the kitchen table, watching adults carry burdens too heavy for children to understand. That child had not chosen fear. She had simply absorbed the emotional climate surrounding her, because that was how children survived. Ethan spoke softly, almost as though he were addressing that younger child as well. The beliefs that once protected you are not your enemies. They were created by a younger mind trying to make sense of a complicated world. The problem begins only when those childhood conclusions continue making adult decisions. Claire opened her eyes and looked again at the unsigned papers. For the first time, she no longer saw them as evidence that life had defeated her. She saw them as proof that every external decision was quietly connected to an internal story. If the story remained unchanged, different circumstances would continue producing familiar outcomes. But if the story itself could change, perhaps the future did not have to repeat the emotional patterns of the past. That possibility did not erase her financial challenges. It did something far more important. It gave her permission to believe that the voice inside her mind was not necessarily the voice of truth. It might simply be the echo of a frightened child who had been trying to keep her safe for far longer than necessary. Claire sat quietly as the room seemed to grow lighter, not because the afternoon sun had changed, but because something inside her had. She was beginning to separate two ideas that had always felt inseparable. One was reality. The other was interpretation. For years she had treated them as the same thing. Ethan noticed the subtle change in her expression. It was the look people often carried when an old belief had begun to crack but had not yet fallen apart. He understood that this was the most delicate moment in any transformation. Most people, when faced with the possibility that a lifelong belief may not be true, instinctively try to defend the belief rather than question it. It feels safer to protect a familiar prison than to step into an unfamiliar freedom. Ethan spoke gently. Claire, I want you to hear something very carefully. You are not broken. You are not lazy. You are not destined to struggle forever. More importantly, you are not being punished. Claire looked at him with surprise. Those words reached a place inside her that years of financial advice had never touched. She realized how often she had quietly judged herself. Every setback became proof that she had failed. Every unexpected expense became evidence that she was somehow incapable. She had mistaken repeated outcomes for permanent identity. Ethan continued. Human beings make one mistake over and over again. They confuse a pattern with a personality. They experience something enough times that eventually they stop saying, "This keeps happening to me," and they begin saying, "This is who I am." That single shift changes everything. Claire slowly repeated the sentence in her mind. She had often described herself as someone who was always struggling financially. She had never noticed that she was no longer describing circumstances. She was describing herself. Ethan reached for the notebook again and opened to a blank page. In the center, he wrote one simple sentence. I am always behind. He turned the notebook toward Claire. Have you ever said something like this? Claire smiled sadly. More times than I can count. Ethan nodded. Now listen carefully. He drew a line through the sentence, and beneath it wrote another. I have experienced seasons where I felt behind. He looked up. Which sentence feels heavier? Claire answered immediately. The first one. Why? Ethan asked. She thought for a moment. Because the first one sounds permanent. The second one sounds temporary. Ethan smiled. Exactly. Your subconscious pays attention to identity far more than circumstance. When you repeatedly define yourself by struggle, your mind quietly begins organizing your decisions around preserving that identity. Not because it wants you to suffer, but because consistency feels safe. Claire stared at the two sentences. They looked almost identical, yet emotionally they lived in completely different worlds. She remembered introducing herself at work as someone who always expected something to go wrong. She remembered laughing whenever friends called her unlucky. She remembered saying, almost proudly, that she had learned never to expect too much because disappointment always followed hope. She had believed she was being realistic. Now she wondered whether she had simply been rehearsing the same identity every day. Ethan quietly closed the notebook. There is another misunderstanding that keeps many people trapped. They believe healing means pretending painful experiences never happened. It does not. Healing means refusing to let yesterday continue introducing itself as tomorrow. Claire felt those words settle deep within her. She did not need to erase her childhood. She did not need to blame her parents. They had done the best they could with the beliefs they had inherited. Perhaps they too had grown up hearing that money always disappeared, that security was fragile, that abundance belonged to someone else. Ethan continued in a calm voice. Every generation passes along two things: visible possessions and invisible beliefs. Most families spend more time discussing inheritance than examining the emotional patterns that quietly travel from one generation to the next. Claire thought about her grandparents, her parents, and herself. Different careers, different neighborhoods, different decades. Yet many of the same fears had quietly survived. The faces had changed. The emotional story had remained remarkably similar. Ethan looked toward the old family photographs resting on the shelf. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not carrying the fears of those who came before you. Sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing those fears to end with you. Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. For the first time, she understood that changing her relationship with money was never about becoming someone else. It was about remembering that beneath years of inherited fear, conditioned beliefs, and familiar emotional patterns, there had always been a quieter part of herself that had never believed she was meant to live in constant scarcity. That part had simply been waiting patiently beneath the noise, hoping that one day she would finally stop mistaking an old survival story for the truth about who she really was. I do not believe that life changes in a single dramatic moment. More often, it changes through one quiet realization that refuses to leave. Claire could feel that realization growing stronger with every passing minute. She looked at Ethan and asked the question that had been forming ever since she remembered the kitchen table from her childhood. If these beliefs were never consciously chosen, how can they feel so powerful? Ethan rested his hands on the back of a chair before answering. Because repetition is one of the strongest teachers the human mind has ever known. The brain does not measure truth by evidence alone. It also measures truth by frequency. Whatever you hear, feel, or experience often enough begins to feel natural. Claire slowly nodded. She thought about the countless times she had heard ordinary phrases throughout her life. Money does not grow on trees. Better save it because something will go wrong. Do not expect too much. Rich people are different. Those sentences had floated through birthdays, family dinners, holiday gatherings, grocery stores, and long drives home. Nobody announced that they were creating lifelong beliefs. They were simply conversations, yet repeated thousands of times. Those conversations quietly became the emotional background music of her life. Ethan walked toward the window once again. Imagine hearing the same song every single morning for 20 years. Eventually, you stop noticing the lyrics, but your mind still remembers every word. Claire smiled softly. So beliefs are like songs I forgot I learned. Ethan nodded. Exactly. The most powerful beliefs are usually the ones you no longer recognize as beliefs. They feel like obvious facts. Claire looked down at her hands. Then maybe I've been defending ideas that were never actually mine. Ethan turned back toward her. That happens more often than people realize. Many of the thoughts we call our own were first spoken by someone else. We simply repeated them until they sounded like our own voice. The room fell silent again. Claire remembered something else from her childhood. Every Friday evening her father would return home exhausted. Before sitting down, he often sighed and quietly said, "Another week just to keep the lights on." At the time, Claire believed adulthood was supposed to feel heavy. Success looked like survival. Peace seemed temporary. Rest almost felt irresponsible. Ethan continued, "Your subconscious does not distinguish between statements spoken with certainty and statements spoken from exhaustion. It records emotional intensity. That is why one emotional moment can influence years of future decisions." Claire realized she had spent years chasing financial security while carrying an emotional definition of money that had been shaped by stress. No wonder earning more had never created lasting peace. Her relationship with money had never been built on trust. It had been built on vigilance. Ethan picked up the old notebook again and drew 2 circles. In the first circle, he wrote the word survival. In the second, he wrote the word creation. "Most people think these 2 states can exist together," he said. "But the mind behaves very differently inside each one." Claire studied the words. Ethan explained, "When you live in survival, your attention narrows. You focus on avoiding loss. Every decision is filtered through fear. Every opportunity is examined for danger before possibility. But when you move into creation, your attention expands. You begin asking different questions. Instead of asking, 'What if I fail?' you begin asking, 'What kind of life am I building?'" Claire could immediately recognize which circle had guided most of her adult life. She had measured success by the absence of crisis rather than the presence of joy. She celebrated paying bills instead of building dreams. She counted what she had avoided losing instead of what she had intentionally created. Ethan gently closed the notebook. There is nothing wrong with survival. Every human being needs it at certain moments. The problem begins when survival becomes your permanent identity. A mind that believes every season is an emergency eventually forgets what peace feels like. Claire felt those words settle deeply inside her. She realized she had been carrying invisible urgency even during calm seasons. If an unexpected check arrived in the mail, she assumed an unexpected expense would soon follow. If work went well, she quietly waited for something to go wrong. She had become so accustomed to preparing for disappointment that she rarely allowed herself to fully experience gratitude. Ethan looked at her with quiet understanding. "Your mind has been trying to protect you by predicting pain before it arrives. But there is a hidden cost to that habit. When you constantly rehearse fear, you become emotionally unavailable for possibility." Claire looked toward the family photographs once more. For the first time, she wondered whether abundance was not something she needed to chase. Perhaps it was something she first needed to stop resisting. The idea felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, yet strangely peaceful. And she began to understand that the greatest prison is not built from locked doors or impossible circumstances. It is built from unquestioned beliefs repeated so many times that they quietly become the invisible walls of everyday life. I want you to notice something that almost nobody talks about. Once you become aware that an old belief is shaping your life, your first instinct is usually to fight it. You tell yourself to think positively. You repeat affirmations. You force optimistic thoughts over painful memories. For a little while it seems to work. Then one unexpected bill arrives, one difficult conversation happens, one disappointing week appears, and suddenly the old emotional pattern returns as though nothing had changed. Claire looked at Ethan with quiet curiosity. "That has happened to me so many times. I thought I was making progress, and then everything felt exactly the same again." Ethan nodded with understanding. "Because you cannot heal a frightened part of yourself by arguing with it." Claire remained silent. Ethan continued, "Imagine a small child who has spent years believing the world is dangerous. If you stand in front of that child and repeatedly say, 'There is nothing to fear,' the child may hear your words, but the fear will remain. Fear rarely disappears because someone tells it to disappear. Fear begins to soften only after it feels safe enough to let go." Claire lowered her eyes. Something about that explanation reached deeper than logic. She suddenly realized she had been treating her own subconscious like an enemy that needed to be defeated instead of a wounded part of herself asking to be understood. Ethan slowly poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to Claire. This is where many people misunderstand an ancient practice called Hooponopono. They believe it is a magical formula that changes the outside world. but its deepest purpose is much quieter than that. Claire wrapped both hands around the glass without taking a sip. Then what is it really? Ethan smiled softly. It is an invitation to stop fighting yourself. The words lingered in the room. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. Every painful emotional pattern leaves behind an invisible memory, not necessarily a detailed picture that you can describe, but an emotional imprint. When similar situations appear later in life, those memories become active again. Hooponopono is not about pretending those memories never existed. It is about meeting them with compassion instead of resistance. Claire remembered all the years she had blamed herself for every financial setback. Every mistake became another reason to criticize herself. Every disappointment became another opportunity to prove she was not good enough. She had believed harsh self-judgment would make her stronger. Instead, it had only made fear louder. Ethan continued. The first words are, "I am sorry." Many people misunderstand them. They think they are apologizing because they did something wrong. That is not the heart of the practice. It is the willingness to acknowledge that pain exists inside your experience. It is a moment of honest awareness. Claire quietly repeated the words. "I am sorry." They felt strangely gentle instead of heavy. Ethan nodded. The second words are, "Please forgive me." Again, this is not about begging for punishment to disappear. It is about releasing the habit of carrying yesterday into today. Sometimes the forgiveness you need most is the forgiveness you have never offered yourself. Claire thought about every decision she still regretted. Investments she never made. Opportunities she declined. Dreams she postponed because fear sounded wiser than hope. She realized she had replayed those moments so often that they had become part of her identity. Ethan continued. The third words are, "Thank you." Gratitude here is not pretending everything is perfect. It is recognizing that awareness itself is already the beginning of freedom. Once you can see a pattern, you are no longer completely controlled by it. Claire slowly inhaled. She had never considered gratitude in that way. She always believed she had to wait until life improved before feeling thankful. Now she wondered whether gratitude could begin while healing was still unfolding. Ethan smiled gently before speaking the final words. "I love you." These words are often the most difficult because many people have spent years believing love must be earned through achievement, sacrifice, or perfection. But healing begins when the frightened parts of you discover that they no longer need to perform in order to be accepted. Claire closed her eyes. She imagined the little girl standing quietly in that childhood kitchen, listening to conversations about bills, shortages, and impossible choices. For the first time, she did not want to silence that child or correct her. She simply wanted to stand beside her. Ethan spoke almost in a whisper. Every time you repeat these 4 simple statements with genuine presence, you are teaching your nervous system something completely new. You are showing the frightened mind that awareness can replace judgment, forgiveness can replace shame, gratitude can replace constant anticipation of loss, and love can exist before external circumstances become perfect. Claire slowly opened her eyes. The room had not changed. The papers were still waiting on the table. The financial challenges were still real. Yet something inside her no longer felt like it was preparing for another battle. Instead, it felt as though an old door that had remained locked for decades had finally begun to open, not because someone forced it from the outside, but because compassion had quietly turned the key from within. I want you to imagine something that is both simple and surprisingly difficult. Imagine holding a single dollar bill in your hands without immediately thinking about paying a bill, solving a problem, or worrying about whether enough money will remain tomorrow. For many people, that sounds almost impossible. Not because of the dollar itself, but because the mind has learned to attach fear to every symbol of money. Claire slowly placed her glass on the table as Ethan reached into his wallet and removed a single $1 bill. He laid it carefully between them without saying anything. They both looked at it for several quiet seconds. Finally, Ethan asked, "What was the very first feeling that appeared?" Claire answered honestly, "Pressure." Ethan nodded. Not because $1 creates pressure, but because your mind has practiced connecting money with pressure for years. Claire looked more closely at the bill. It was ordinary, worn from passing through countless hands. Yet somehow it carried an emotional weight far greater than its monetary value. Ethan continued, "Most people believe they have a money problem. Often they have an emotional association problem. The money simply becomes the object that activates an older memory. Claire remained quiet. Ethan gently pushed the dollar toward her. Close your eyes for a moment. Do not think about budgets, investments, debt, or income. Just notice what your body feels. Claire followed his instructions. At first, she noticed tension in her shoulders, then a slight tightening in her stomach. Her breathing became shallower without her trying to change it. Ethan waited until several moments had passed before speaking again. Do not judge anything you notice. There is nothing to fix. There is only something to witness. Claire realized how unfamiliar those words felt. Nearly every challenge in her life had been approached with the same strategy. Identify the problem. Solve it immediately. Push harder. Think faster. Yet Ethan was asking her to do something entirely different. Simply observe. As she continued sitting quietly, another memory surfaced. She remembered opening her first paycheck as a teenager. Instead of excitement, she had immediately started calculating how quickly the money would disappear. Even before receiving it, she had emotionally spent it. She had never paused long enough to experience appreciation. Ethan seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The nervous system speaks before the thinking mind catches up, he said softly. If you only listen to your thoughts, you miss the deeper conversation happening inside your body. Claire slowly opened her eyes. I have spent years trying to change my thinking. I never realized my body was carrying its own memories. Ethan smiled. That is why healing cannot happen through ideas alone. Your body also needs a new experience. He gently pointed toward the dollar bill. Now quietly repeat the 4 phrases, not to the money itself, but to every fearful memory that awakens when you look at it. Claire took a slow breath. I am sorry. She paused. The words did not feel like weakness. They felt like recognition. Please forgive me. She noticed her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you. For the first time, she felt grateful, not because all her financial problems had disappeared, but because she could finally see the emotional pattern instead of unconsciously living inside it. Finally, she whispered, I love you. The words felt awkward at first, then unexpectedly gentle. Ethan allowed the silence to remain. He understood that silence was often where the deepest work happened. After another moment, he quietly asked, Did the dollar change? Claire smiled faintly. No. Did your circumstances change? No. Ethan nodded. Then what changed? Claire looked down at the bill once more. It no longer felt like an accusation. It no longer seemed to represent fear or failure. It had become simply what it always was, a tool. She answered almost in disbelief. My relationship with it changed. Ethan smiled warmly. Exactly. Transformation often begins long before external results appear. First, your relationship changes. Then your choices change. Then your habits change. Finally, your life begins reflecting those quiet internal shifts. Claire looked around the room again. Everything appeared exactly as it had an hour before, yet she experienced it differently. The old clock no longer reminded her only of years filled with struggle. It reminded her that time also allowed new patterns to be practiced. The family photographs no longer represented inherited limitations alone. They reminded her that every generation has the opportunity to end emotional patterns that previous generations never knew how to heal. For the first time in many years, she realized that true abundance might not begin with receiving more. It might begin with no longer allowing fear to define the meaning of what she already held in her hands. Claire remained seated for several minutes after the exercise, gently turning the $1 bill between her fingers. It looked exactly the same as before, yet she no longer felt the invisible pressure she had carried only moments earlier. The change was subtle. No dramatic revelation. No sudden miracle. Just a quiet sense that something inside her had stopped resisting. Ethan noticed the peaceful expression beginning to replace the tension that had rested on her face all afternoon. Do you know why this feels unfamiliar? He asked. Claire nodded slightly. Because I have never looked at money without expecting fear. Ethan smiled. There is another layer that many people never discover. Claire looked up with curiosity. What is it? Ethan sat back and allowed a brief silence before answering. Sometimes people are not afraid of staying poor. Sometimes they are afraid of becoming abundant. Claire immediately shook her head. That does not make sense. Why would anyone fear abundance? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked another question. If tomorrow morning you woke up with complete financial freedom, what would change besides your bank account? Claire opened her mouth to answer, but stopped. Images began appearing faster than words. She imagined telling old friends that she no longer worried about bills. She imagined relatives making uncomfortable comments. She imagined people accusing her of changing. She imagined guilt rising inside her simply because life had become easier. Ethan watched quietly as understanding slowly appeared across her face. "You see it now," he said softly. Claire whispered, "I never thought about that before." Ethan nodded. For some people, abundance feels like betrayal. Not betrayal of other people intentionally, but betrayal of the identity they have carried for years. If your family survived by believing that struggle proved honesty, then peace can feel undeserved. If sacrifice became your definition of love, receiving with ease may feel uncomfortable. Claire remembered countless conversations throughout her childhood. Family members admired those who worked until exhaustion. Rest was often described as laziness. Financial success was admired from a distance but quietly questioned up close. Whenever someone in the neighborhood bought a nicer home or a newer car, there was always another explanation. They must have been lucky. They probably had connections. They must have sacrificed something more important. Those conversations had sounded harmless at the time. Now Claire realized they had quietly taught her that abundance always came with emotional consequences. Ethan continued, "The subconscious always asks one question before accepting any new identity. Will I still belong?" Claire felt something tighten gently inside her chest. Belonging. She had never connected belonging with money before. Yet suddenly it explained so much. Every time she imagined becoming financially secure, another part of her quietly worried about becoming different from the people she loved. Ethan spoke gently. Human beings are wired for connection. Thousands of years ago, belonging to the group often meant survival. Your nervous system still carries traces of that ancient instinct. If success appears to threaten connection, your subconscious may quietly pull you back toward what feels emotionally familiar. Claire slowly breathed out. She realized that every time she had approached a major opportunity, there had been two voices inside her. One voice spoke about possibility. The other whispered about separation. She had always believed the second voice was wisdom. Perhaps it had simply been fear wearing the mask of loyalty. Ethan reached toward the family photographs resting nearby. He pointed to one picture showing several generations gathered around a dining table. "Look closely," he said. "Love does not require repeating someone else's pain. Honoring your family does not mean inheriting every fear they carried. Sometimes the greatest respect you can show those who came before you is allowing healing to continue where survival once had to begin." Claire looked at the photograph with new eyes. She no longer saw generations trapped by limitation. She saw generations doing the best they could with the understanding they possessed. None of them had intentionally taught fear. They had simply passed along what they believed would keep the next generation safe. Ethan continued, "Compassion changes everything. When you stop blaming yourself, you stop needing to fight yourself. When you stop blaming the past, you stop needing to escape it. Then something remarkable becomes possible. You begin choosing your future instead of automatically repeating your history." Claire looked once more at the unsigned papers waiting on the table. They still represented an important decision, but they no longer carried the emotional weight of an entire lifetime. She finally understood that the deepest transformation was not learning how to earn more money. It was learning that she could remain connected to the people she loved while releasing the fears they had unknowingly passed forward. In that quiet realization, abundance no longer felt like abandoning her past. It began to feel like offering a gentler future to everyone who would come after her. Claire sat quietly as the afternoon light slowly stretched across the wooden floor. Nothing outside the house had changed. Cars continued passing. Birds continued singing. The old clock continued marking each second with steady precision. Yet inside her, something had become unmistakably different. She no longer felt as though life were happening to her. She had begun to recognize that much of what she called reality had actually been a conversation taking place inside her own mind for many years. Ethan looked toward the window before speaking again. "There is one last misunderstanding we need to clear away before everything begins to fit together." Claire nodded. "What is it?" Ethan answered calmly. "Many people believe money leaves them because life is unfair. Sometimes life is unfair, but often money leaves long before it physically disappears." Claire looked confused. Ethan gently placed the $1 bill back into his wallet. "Think about every financial decision you have ever made. Before you spent money, Before you rejected an opportunity, before you accepted less than you deserved, something happened first. Claire thought carefully. I had a feeling. Ethan smiled. Exactly. Every external action is preceded by an internal emotional state. If fear consistently comes first, your decisions eventually begin serving fear instead of serving your future. Claire reflected on countless moments from her own life. She remembered accepting lower salaries because she feared asking for more. She remembered delaying investments because waiting felt safer. She remembered making purchases that offered temporary emotional comfort after difficult weeks, only to regret them later. Each decision had seemed unrelated at the time. Now they appeared connected by one invisible thread. Ethan continued, money does not respond to panic very well. Neither do human beings. When the nervous system believes it is under threat, its goal becomes immediate relief instead of long-term wisdom. That is why emotionally exhausted people often make decisions that intellectually confuse them later. Claire slowly nodded. She could see the pattern clearly now. It was never simply about numbers. It was about the emotional condition from which those numbers were managed. Ethan reached toward the old clock once more. Imagine trying to read the correct time while shaking the clock with both hands. The problem is not the clock. The problem is the constant movement. In the same way, many people try to make important financial decisions while their emotions are being shaken by fear, shame, guilt, or urgency. Claire quietly laughed to herself. That explains why I often regretted decisions I thought were logical. Ethan nodded. They probably were logical according to the emotional state you were experiencing at that moment. Claire felt another layer of understanding settle into place. She had always assumed wisdom meant thinking harder. She was beginning to realize that wisdom often began by becoming calmer. Ethan continued, there is an important difference between reacting and responding. Reaction belongs to the memory of the past. Response belongs to the awareness of the present. The subconscious reacts because it recognizes familiar emotional patterns. Conscious awareness creates enough space for a different response to become possible. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment and imagined the countless times she had opened her banking application while already expecting bad news. Even before reading the balance, her body prepared for disappointment. She realized that expectation itself had influenced every decision that followed. Ethan spoke softly. Your relationship with money is never only about money. It reflects your relationship with trust, safety, worthiness, patience, gratitude, and hope. That is why changing external habits without addressing internal emotions often feels like pushing against a locked door. Claire slowly opened her eyes. The old fear had not completely disappeared, but it no longer felt like the unquestioned authority it once had been. It had become something she could observe instead of automatically obey. Ethan smiled warmly. That is the beginning of freedom. Not because fear never appears again, but because fear no longer gets to introduce itself as the voice of truth. Claire looked once more toward the family photographs. For the first time, she silently thanked every experience that had brought her to this moment, even the painful ones. They had shaped her, but they did not have to define her. She finally understood that abundance was not simply the accumulation of money. It was the quiet ability to meet life without allowing inherited fear to make every important decision. In that realization, the future no longer looked like a repetition of yesterday. It looked like open space waiting for a new story, one thoughtful choice, one peaceful breath, and one compassionate moment at a time. Claire looked at the unsigned papers one more time, then gently moved them to the side of the table. For the first time, she understood that rushing another decision while carrying an old emotional state would simply repeat an old pattern. Ethan noticed the quiet confidence in that simple gesture. It was not dramatic, yet it revealed something important. Claire was no longer reacting. She was beginning to respond. Ethan smiled softly. Now that you understand where the pattern comes from, there is one final step before your daily life begins reflecting what you have discovered today. Claire nodded. What do I need to do? Ethan answered, practice. Not because you are trying to become someone new, but because you are teaching your nervous system that a different way of living is now safe. Claire listened carefully. Ethan continued, healing is rarely created by one profound moment. It is created by many ordinary moments experienced differently. He placed the notebook back in front of her and drew 7 small circles across the page. Think of this as 7 days, not 7 tests. There is nothing to pass. There is only something to notice. Claire leaned closer. Ethan pointed to the first circle. On the first day, every time you touch money, whether it is $1 or $1,000, stop for a few seconds before doing anything else. Do not spend it. Do not judge it. Simply notice the very first emotion your body produces. Claire nodded slowly. Just observe. Exactly, Ethan replied. Awareness always comes before transformation. He pointed to the second circle. On the second day, every time fear appears around money, do not argue with it. Do not suppress it. Simply say, "Thank you for trying to protect me." Remember, fear learned this job a long time ago. You are not trying to destroy it. You are helping it realize the emergency has ended. Claire smiled gently. That idea felt surprisingly compassionate. Ethan continued toward the third circle. On the third day, quietly repeat the 4 Hooponopono phrases whenever an old financial memory appears. Not as magic words, as a conversation with the part of yourself that still believes survival depends on struggle. I am sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Claire softly repeated each phrase again. This time they felt less unfamiliar. Ethan pointed toward the fourth circle. The fourth day is about receiving. If someone offers you a compliment, help, kindness, or generosity, pause before rejecting it. Many people who struggle with receiving money also struggle with receiving love, appreciation, or support. The nervous system often treats them the same way. Claire remembered how often she answered compliments by minimizing them or changing the subject. She had always believed humility required rejection. Perhaps true humility allowed gratitude instead. Ethan continued. The fifth day is simple. Every evening, write down one moment when you noticed yourself reacting differently than your old pattern. It does not have to be dramatic. Maybe you paused before making an emotional purchase. Maybe you noticed fear without obeying it. Small moments become new emotional evidence. Claire understood. Her mind had spent decades collecting proof that scarcity was normal. Now she would begin collecting proof that peace was also possible. Ethan moved to the sixth circle. Choose one financial decision this week that you intentionally delay until your body feels calm. Not because you are avoiding it, but because clarity deserves a peaceful nervous system. Claire laughed softly. That alone might change half my decisions. Ethan smiled. More than you imagine. Finally, he pointed to the seventh and last circle. At the end of the week, ask yourself one question. Do I feel different around money, even if my financial situation has not completely changed yet? Claire looked thoughtful. Why does that question matter so much? Ethan answered gently. Because external change often follows internal consistency. If you judge healing only by your bank account, you may miss the most important progress happening beneath the surface. First, your emotional relationship changes. Then your choices become different. Those choices slowly create different results. Claire looked around the room one final time. The old clock continued its steady rhythm. The family photographs remained where they had always been. The afternoon sun had nearly disappeared beyond the trees outside the window. Everything familiar was still present, yet nothing inside her felt exactly the same. She realized that throughout her life, she had waited for circumstances to give her permission to feel peaceful. Today she had discovered another possibility. Peace could become the place from which new circumstances were created. She carefully folded the blank page with the 7 circles and slipped it into her notebook. It was not a guarantee that every financial challenge would immediately disappear. It was something quieter and perhaps even more valuable. It was a daily reminder that every moment of awareness interrupted an old pattern. Every compassionate response softened a fearful memory. Every calm decision strengthened a new identity. And every gentle practice became another step away from inherited scarcity and another step toward a life no longer directed by the echoes of yesterday. Claire carefully closed the notebook and looked once more at the unsigned papers resting quietly on the table. Hours earlier, they had felt like proof that her life was collapsing. Now they looked like something entirely different. They were simply a decision waiting for a different version of herself to make it. Ethan stood and walked toward the front door before turning back one final time. There is something I want you to remember long after today is over. Claire listened carefully. Ethan spoke with the calm certainty that had guided every conversation since they first sat down together. Your life has never been controlled by a single moment. It has always been shaped by thousands of moments repeated often enough to become your reality. That means the same principle that built an old pattern can also build a new one. Claire slowly stood and joined him near the doorway. The evening air drifted through the open window, carrying the familiar sounds of the neighborhood. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked. Wind moved gently through the trees. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. Yet Claire no longer felt like the same person standing inside it. She looked back at the family photographs one last time. For most of her life, she had believed they represented the limits she would never escape. Now she saw something else. She saw generations of people doing the best they could with the understanding they possessed. They had survived difficult seasons. They had carried responsibilities she could only imagine. They had passed forward love together with fear because they did not know those two things could be separated. Claire felt no anger toward them, only compassion. Ethan quietly said, "The purpose of awareness is never to create blame. It is to create freedom. When you understand where a pattern began, you no longer need to spend your life arguing with it. You simply stop feeding it." Claire smiled gently. She finally understood why every attempt to force positive thinking had failed. She had been trying to silence an old survival story instead of listening to it with kindness. She had been trying to become someone worthy of abundance instead of recognizing that worth had never disappeared beneath the fear. It had only been forgotten. Ethan reached for the doorknob but paused before opening it. "There is one final truth I hope you carry with you." Claire nodded. Ethan continued, "Money is not your identity. Success is not your identity. Failure is not your identity. Even the fears you have carried for years are not your identity. They are experiences. They are memories. They are emotional habits. But they are not the deepest truth about who you are." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment and allowed those words to settle inside her. She realized that nearly every painful label she had carried throughout adulthood had begun with two simple words. I am. I am behind. I am unlucky. I am always struggling. I am not good with money. She finally understood that those sentences had never described her. They had only described the stories her frightened mind had repeated. And stories, no matter how old they become, can always be rewritten. She slowly walked back toward the table, picked up the unsigned papers, and placed them neatly inside a folder instead of rushing to make a decision. That small action represented far more than postponing a signature. It represented the end of allowing fear to decide before wisdom had a chance to speak. She then slipped the $1 bill into the front pocket of her notebook, not as a lucky charm, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a quiet reminder that every external object carries only the meaning the mind chooses to give it. From that day forward, whenever she noticed anxiety rising around money, she no longer treated it as evidence that something was wrong with her. She treated it as an invitation to pause, breathe, observe, and return to compassion. Sometimes she quietly repeated, "I am sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you." Not because the words magically erased every difficulty, but because they gently reminded her that healing begins inside the relationship she has with herself. Weeks passed, then months. Some challenges remained. Others slowly faded. New opportunities appeared, not because the universe suddenly became different, but because Claire was no longer meeting every opportunity through the same invisible filter of inherited fear. She noticed herself asking different questions. She made decisions with greater patience. She allowed herself to receive help without guilt. She celebrated progress without immediately expecting disaster. Most importantly, she no longer measured her future by the emotional memories of her past. One quiet evening, she glanced again at the old family photographs and smiled. For the first time, she realized that the greatest gift she could offer the generations before her was not repeating their fears in the name of loyalty. The greatest gift was allowing their courage to continue while gently releasing the burdens they had unknowingly carried. And perhaps that is where true abundance has always begun. Not in a wallet, not in a bank account, not in a number written on a screen. It begins in the silent moment when a human being finally recognizes that the voice of fear may have been familiar for many years, but familiarity has never been the same as truth. From that moment forward, every peaceful choice becomes another sentence in a new story. Every compassionate breath becomes another step away from inherited scarcity. And every ordinary day becomes living proof that a healed mind can create a future that an unhealed memory could never imagine.